Hey, Coach JZ here with the Lifetime Athlete, and thank you for being with me today. I want to talk about the squat, or particularly about squatting. And the squat is one of our major movement patterns. It's also a valuable exercise to put into the training system or long-term athletic development plan for any lifetime athlete. So this could be someone who is at an elite level in their teens, 20s, or possibly 30s, or someone who's also later on in life and working at preserving their performance capacity and chasing and achieving goals. So a lot of what we do with exercise selection here at the Lifetime Athlete is based on assessments and what are the conditions or the context in which an athlete is existing. What do they lack? What do they need? What are their goals? What's their body type? All of those things and many more need to go into consideration. And then ultimately, we come up with some ways to apply squatting. Now, this might not represent every way I do things, but it's certainly something that I will utilize often. I will look at squatting for three major areas. And first of all, that could be mobility. It could be muscular hypertrophy, making those gains, as well as athleticism. And I'm going to try to compare and contrast these in today's relatively brief video. So first of all, when we're looking at squatting for mobility, in all probability, our goal is to work towards having a full range squat, being able to do that. In many cases, people already have that, but in a lot of cases, we do have to restore it. So that's one of our approaches or focus. When we're doing a full range squat, many times it is of great benefit to start out at least with heels elevated. And so that's why I put this question mark there, because we may want to use wedges or boards or blocks or ramps to create a heels elevated position for the squat, decrease the dorsiflexion demand, allow that individual to be more vertical or squatty with his or her squat, and also to access those deeper ranges of motion. So that's a great training tool that will often get used. Also, when our goal is training for mobility, we probably don't need to use heavy loads, so we'll use light to moderate loads, and you can kind of think about what those definitions mean to you. But we're not really going for max effort when mobility is our first consideration. Typically, and again, this might be, a lot of these things might be variable, like with the heels elevated, for example, I'll try to move an athlete away from that for some of their squatting eventually, just to make sure that they are able to have that mobility with feet flat. But that's something we work up to. Well, same thing's true with where we put the load. I like for a mobility application to use a front load. So that could be a front squat, a goblet squat, Zercher squat, different types of holds and positions. But when we put that weight in front of the body, it does create a favorable alignment of the center of mass over the base of support, allows us to be a little less hingy in our squat pattern and to access those depths. Not that being hingy is always bad, and I'm going to talk about that later. Also, when we're squatting for mobility, what we're trying to do is maintain that aspect of function. It's a functional movement pattern. Everyone should be able to assume a full squat, easily, comfortably get in and out of it. And that's often a goal for athletes at every age. We're also trying to access those positions and have good movement variability, which is a popular term these days. A lot of times also we'll use isometrics. Now, isometrics can be more perhaps effective or useful in split stance squats, which are really variations of our lunge position, but in even squatting for mobility with a somewhat parallel squat, we might use isometrics to gain a greater ownership of mid-range or to work on stretching and sinking into the depth or bottom of that. So those are some thoughts on mobility and squatting for mobility. Now, when we look at hypertrophy, this is kind of a middle range where we're really trying to stimulate muscular adaptation, muscular growth in most cases, and perhaps to a secondary extent, fatigue resistance and endurance. Well, one of the things we're going to do when we're squatting for hypertrophy is we're probably going to use variable range of motion. Some of that might be full range, and there's certainly some people who are much in favor of that and some literature to support it. And we can also use some partial range of motion. Question mark, will we keep the feet flat? And that's a big maybe. Most of the time, probably the answer is yes. However, we can mix this up quite a bit. When we're training for hypertrophy, we want to take that trainee and condition their connective tissues and their central nervous system and their movement patterns to be able to tolerate the use of moderate to heavy loads. So this is heavy weight, or it's heavy resistance in other forms, such as with machines or bands. There are many, many techniques to performing the squat exercise in general, and when muscular hypertrophy is our goal, we may select from quite a variety, again, depending upon the athlete and that athlete's needs. And also, even when you're trying to target different areas of muscle development, you can make some variations in your squat pattern to affect your outcome. Then we look at, there's a bit of verbiage here, TUT, that's time under tension. We want to have a fairly high degree of time under tension because that's a stimulus for muscular adaptation, as is some degree of overt tissue and metabolic stress. These are well-known and evidence-based principles. And probably the most important thing is that when we are training for muscular hypertrophy, we need to go to near failure, at least on some of our sets, particularly our working sets. This would be a rate of perceived exertion of 9 out of 10, or 9 plus, and then a reps in reserve, or repetitions in reserve, of perhaps 1 to 0. There are some studies that will suggest that you can even make hypertrophy gains with an RIR of 2 or 3. However, the results may be greater if we go to 1 and possibly 0. So that's kind of some thoughts and some principles about hypertrophy training. Now, if I kind of slide over in front of you guys and say, well, now we're training for athleticism. And in the lifetime athlete, we certainly want mobility. We may need to do some hypertrophy, but we're always training for this athleticism, the pinnacle of output and aesthetic performance, and generally just kicking in. So first of all, I'm going to say that in most circumstances, in an athletic training situation, we're going to use a partial range of squat. And more often than not, that's going to be in the upper half of the squat. So from the top down, we're probably looking at what would classically be called a half squat, and we'll even use a quarter squat. One of the things that we'll also do is we're going to use a variety of stances. They're not all going to be, let's say, bilateral, sagittal, and symmetrical, and squared up. We want to practice using some asymmetric stances and also asymmetric loads within the foot itself, as in more medial, lateral, heel, forefoot, and different from foot to foot, because this is how many athletic movements, change direction, jumping activities will occur. So we train those varied stances. Also, we can use a wide range of weights. We may use very light weights when we're thinking of moving very rapidly, and then when we're also trying to be gaining a little bit of some of these hypertrophy types of things within our athletic model. We might use heavy. Again, we're going to mix it up. Then we go to the back squat, or the back loaded squat. So that's usually with a barbell high back squat typically, although the low bar squat for powerlifters is applicable. We might use sandbags or other devices. When we load up here, now yes, coming back, this does make our squat a little bit hingy, but that doesn't necessarily make it a non-functional pattern. Even if it's hybridized between a squat and a hinge or possibly deadlift type movement, when we're back loaded, that's usually when we can safely and comfortably really put loads onto the body and you have them secured for high stimulus. This brings us to the topic of strength. And so I didn't say squatting for mobility, hypertrophy, strength, and athleticism. I include strength as an athletic capacity. In fact, it's one of the big 5: strength, power, speed, agility, and endurance. You can present those in any order. So a power lifter is an athlete because that's their sport. So they're going to train fairly specifically, and I think we all know that model. But for many athletes, we may not emphasize kind of the slow grinding type of strength training. We may be more into the elasticity realm. Sometimes that's considered to be more tendinous or fascial in nature. And this varies amongst athletes and sports, but we're gonna use those principles a little more in our squatting, and that's where the speed of movement or the rate of force development comes into play. Generally speaking, most sports are played on the balls of the feet. They're played in relatively upright positions, some amount of flexion, but not too deep, and they're played at high speeds. And so when we think about using those quarter and half squats, sometimes with that light, moderate weight, and then really rapid forces, this is where we get at least the potential for greater transfer of training. And then ultimately, I like to look at oscillation or oscillatory reps. So you can take that isometric idea and then you can cut into a portion of range of motion which might be needed to be developed in an athlete, and we can do oscillatory reps, small excursions, almost vibrating. A great tool. Again, there are many more ways of looking at this, but this is one way I like to break things down to help the people that I am coaching and doing online physical therapy and performance enhancement work with. And really it all comes down to, I think this is my word, guys, it's being a movement smith. We want every lifetime athlete to be a movement smith, and that's someone who owns every position, so can easily get into and out of every position, and a person who has mastery of motion in every direction from those positions. That's a movement smith, and that's what we do in training at TLA, and this is how we use the squat exercise in some of those applications. So thanks so much for being with me. If you'd like more information about what's going on at The Lifetime Athlete, you can go to thelifetimeathlete.com or check out at The Lifetime Athlete on Instagram. Thanks again, Coach Jay-Z, signing out. Until next time.